Okay, well, good afternoon, almost good evening, everybody. My name's Tom Clockerty. I'm the Research Director and Head of Tax at the Centre for Policy Studies, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here to In-House this evening for our panel discussion. We are talking about Drop the Crops. It's a new report we have out today, authored by Dillon Smith, sitting at the end of the table there. The future of the biofuels mandate. You're not going to hear very much from me this evening. Shortly I'll hand over to Emma Revell, our Head of Comms, who will oversee the rest of proceedings. But just want to say a couple of quick thank yous. First of all, to the European Climate Foundation for sponsoring this report and the event this evening, and of course to In-House for lending us this lovely facility to host you all in. The report, Drop the Crops, is available on our website, cps.org.uk, and it's well worth a read. Perhaps you're all seasoned veterans of the biofuels debate and know this topic inside and out. I'll admit that I knew almost nothing until Dillon put the first draft in my inbox, and I think it's a great piece of work that explores a complicated issue very effectively and in quite a balanced way, although of course we do come down on one side of the debate rather than the other, as I think will become clear in the next half an hour or so. Anyway, enough from me. Emma, over to you.
I'm Emma Revell. I'm the Head of Communications at the Centre for Policy Studies, and I'm joined this evening, if I start on my left, by Dillon Smith. He's the researcher for energy and environment policy at the Centre for Policy Studies. Then we have Howard Cox, who is the founder of Fairfuel UK. Dustin Benton is the policy director at the Green Alliance, and hopefully, shortly, we will be joined by Matt Culley, who is the Combinable Crops Chair at the National Farmers Union. He's running a little bit late, unfortunately, but will be with us shortly. I'm not the person you really want to hear from either, actually, so I'm going to hand straight over to Dillon to give us an overview of his report, which, as Tom said, is out today. There are QR codes dotted around on chairs if anyone wants to download a copy while you're here.
Amazing, thanks Emma. So great to see everybody here. Thank you all so much for coming. We are here to talk about an important issue, and it's one that I think that goes somewhat underappreciated in the UK's climate debate, and that is biofuels for transport. Although most people seem unaware, the E10 and the B7 grades at the forecourt require a certain percentage of biofuels to be blended into petrol and diesel. This policy is known as the Renewable Transport Fuel Obligation, the RTFO, and it dates from the pre-EV era, brought in by the last Labour government. At that time, biofuels seemed like a promising solution to decarbonising road transport. Fast forward to 2023, and it's become clear that zero-emissions vehicles like EVs will be the way forward, at least for cars. And unlike decarbonisation policies that will ultimately save consumers money over the longer term, such as EVs or insulation or offshore wind, biofuels genuinely do make life more expensive by passing on the higher costs of biofuels to motorists. The RTFO has gone through some important changes over the last 15 years, and for example, much of the program has shifted over to using waste-based fuels rather than crops. However, as we discuss in the report, food crops such as corn and wheat still comprise the majority of our bioethanol supply, which is what goes into petrol, and this is where we take real issue. The original environmental logic seemed sound. Crops absorb CO2 from the atmosphere when they grow, and so when you burn them in a car and displace petrol or diesel, overall emissions will be reduced, even if they still do emit CO2, like fossil fuels at the tailpipe. But once put into practice, a whole host of issues began to emerge. Incentivizing farmers to grow crops for fuel meant that more land around the world needed to be found to grow food. And yet chopping down a forest to plant crops is terrible for the environment and biodiversity, as well as potentially destroying any theoretical emission savings. This issue became known as indirect land use change, i.e. the indirect effects that biofuels mandates have on land use around the world. And unfortunately, a plethora of scientific studies have shown that indirect land use change can diminish or destroy the CO2 rationale for crop-based biofuels. Then, there's the impact on food security and prices. According to the latest government estimates, almost 36,000 hectares of British farmland is being used to grow crops for biofuels. Our friends at the Green Alliance have calculated that if including the land used abroad, 3.5 million people could be fed every year if the UK stopped using crop-based bioethanol. And of course, creating such a large source of artificial demand for these crops drives up prices, hitting the world's poor hardest. In our view, this land should be used to feed people. But even if we were to say that this land needed to be used for environmental purposes, biofuels would be unlikely to be the first choice. Studies have shown that the emission savings would likely be substantially higher if that land was turned over to rewilding, or solar panels, for example, and would be a far more efficient use of our land. Now, the government does recognize the negatives of crop-based biofuels and has introduced measures into the program to discourage their use, such as a cap and the double counting of waste feedstocks. However, we're calling for them to go further and phase down food crops entirely as soon as practically possible. We should also work with our allies around the world to improve food security, benefiting the world's poor. I'm pleased to say this message has been endorsed by farmers like the Nature Friendly Farming Network, but of course, not all farmers share our view. Moving to the waste side of things, almost all of our current biodiesel supply now comes from waste, primarily used cooking oil. Provided these are stored sustainably, they can have much more substantial emission savings and can be particularly valuable in transport modes and sectors where zero emissions options are further off, such as trucking or aviation or shipping. Same is true for other more advanced fuels, such as hydrogen and e-fuels. And in the report, we also discuss whether electricity should be included in the RTFO, giving a boost to the country's charging network. However, there are issues here to be aware of as well. Creating such strong economic incentives for substances that are meant to be waste can create opportunities for bad actors and unintended consequences. While there are safeguards in place designed to prevent such outcomes, in our report we recommend ways in which the government can tighten up this regime, such as rigorous database tracking. Overall, government needs to be vigilant regarding the unintended consequences of this policy. That means phasing out biofuels from food crops while helping to sustainably scale up waste-based fuels and other advanced fuels in the sectors that need them most. With that, I will stop blabbing and hand over to the panel.
Thanks, Dillon. Thanks very much. Dustin.
Thank you. We are very tightly timetabled. That was incredibly crisp. I'm going to try to keep my remarks as crisp as that. I think I've basically got two messages, but the first thing I want to say is just to praise the quality of this report. It's really thoughtful. It's really balanced. It's thought through the issues. Particularly, I like the take on if we just incentivize waste fuels, makes a lot of sense until somebody decides that it's really smart to fry the potatoes once and then dump the rest into used cooking oil. So I really appreciate the thoughtfulness of the analysis that Dillon and the team has done. But the story, I basically want to tell you two things. The first is a little bit about the history of biofuels, because I think it's helpful to understand why we've ended up where we are. And the second is a comment about technology. So on the history, my accent will have given me away. I'm from the United States. The US is kind of where biofuels got their massive big boost. And they really got a kick in about 2005, shortly after the 2004 presidential election. So you might be wondering, why am I telling you this story about the United States and American politics? It's because of Iowa. Iowa is an incredibly important state in the United States. It's where the primaries take place. And it's a massive corn growing state. And in the decade before the 2005 decision to go big on biofuels, maize prices in the US were at a terribly low level. They were about $2.50 per bushel. This was a problem for Iowan farmers because they weren't making enough money on them. And lo and behold, the solution of biofuels presented itself. How do we mop up these amazing crop surpluses, turn them into bioenergy, create a new market for farmers, raise the price of maize? Biofuels. The reason I'm telling you this story is that the origin story of biofuels is about supporting farmers and raising food prices. It wasn't really about the climate. It wasn't a story that came out of the environmental community saying, gosh, we're desperate for these things. And that policy was really effective. Between 2007 and 2010, the price of maize in the United States went up to $3.50 per bushel. Super effective at raising the prices of food. You have to cast your mind back a bit. I mean, this was a period when we had so much food, we were sort of tripping over ourselves. It looks very different from today, where food prices are high and we've got some scarcity challenges. So that's kind of story one. I should also say in the UK, there was a big pushback from the environmental community back in, I think, 2006. Which led to a review which caused the UK's biofuels policy to get delayed a bit. So it certainly in the UK, there's never been a kind of full-bore go for biofuels for green reasons kind of thing. The second story I want to tell is about technology. So biofuels, when I think about how I want to support people to decarbonize, change the world, I'm always looking for new technologies which allow me as an environmentalist to say, I'm going to make your life better by bringing this cool new technology to the market and giving you cheaper and greener at the same time. That is the holy grail for me. And biofuels, they just don't do that. It's for a really simple reason. Biofuels, particularly crop-based biofuels, are an incredibly ancient technology. I think it was the Sumerians who 10,000 years ago first worked out how to make alcohol out of grains, but a lot of good parties since. The point is, we haven't really got any better at making ethanol out of crops over that 10,000 years. By contrast, we've got really good at making EVs. So back in 2010, the price of EV batteries was something like, let me check my notes, $1,200 per kilowatt hour. Today, there are $141 per kilowatt hour. And if you're willing to buy your EV from China, they apparently will give you a car with batteries that cost $60 per kilowatt hour. This is an extraordinary technology curve. And when I think about how we decarbonize, I want to back those technologies that are greener and cheaper, not those Neolithic technologies, which, although I enjoy a beer, are probably not best put in our cars. Anyway, I'm going to pause there. Thank you.
That was very efficient on the timing again. Thank you. Howard, if you'd like to go next. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's no problem at all.
I've just had a text from the back of the room saying we need to speak directly into the mics.
Okay.
Not as sensitive as we would hope.
Okay, hello everyone. I don't know if anyone knows me. I'm Howard Cox from Fairfuel UK. I've been campaigning since 2010 and we've managed in that time to keep fuel duty frozen. And that's really down to our campaign. I'm really worried that I actually agree with a lot of what Dustin said. It is a big worry, because the Greens hate me, especially people like Caroline Lucas. From a point of view of what I'm here for, really, is I'm speaking on behalf of drivers and HGV drivers, truckers, motorbike, etc. And let me make it very clear. Drivers want clean air too. They want low emissions. They want all of this. But they don't want it done on a political basis to look good in front of the rest of the world. We've got a 2030 ban coming up of new diesel and petrol cars. And the only way electric vehicles with this incredible technology, and I must remind you, Dustin, from cradle to grave, in terms of production and disposal of an electric vehicle, there's not much difference in terms of emissions with a petrol or diesel vehicle in a cradle to grave lifespan. What we do need to do is to be honest with people. And at the moment, what we're being told, and not consulted with the major stakeholders, 37 million drivers in this country, have been told, you've got to change your car, you've got to change your petrol, your diesel vehicle, which you've relied upon, and buy a very expensive electric vehicle that is not reliable, it's very expensive to service, all those sorts of things. But technology will evolve. And that's where everyone would agree that we do not need a ban in 2030 to actually make one particular mode of transport a success, i.e. electric vehicles. What we need to do is all join up together and get clean fuel technologies, hydrogen, synthetic fuels, all those sorts of things. And there's even now fuel catalysts. From your country in the USA, in Texas, it's a legal requirement to put a fuel catalyst into petrol and diesel when you fill up at the station, which halves particulates, halves NOx emissions, all these sorts of things. But instead, we've got a government that is hell-bent on leading the way to 2030, when Germany and Italy and the rest of Europe are 2035, and really Germany and Italy want to move it to 2040. Why do we want to lead the way in bankrupting the UK? We just finished a report with the CEBR which showed that actually, if you imagine it, you're a minister and I've come to visit you, and I'm a special advisor. I said, I've got this great idea, Minister. Tell you what, £85 billion of environmental benefits I can get you if you get rid of new diesel, new petrol cars by 2030. You go, really? That's great news. Oh, hang on, how much it's going to cost? 450 billion. The 5 times the alleged benefits is going to cost the economy. And where I sit here is I support anything that cleans the environment. I'm right behind it, totally for it, but not at the risk of actually breaking people's wallets and hitting them in the pocket. That's me.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Matt, thank you for the difficult journey you've had to get here, but thanks. I'll let you do your opening comments.
Okay, thank you. And again, apologies for my lateness. Public transport at its best. So I'm not here to talk about green technologies. I'm here to talk about the biofuels mandates on behalf of UK growers, UK farmers. I represent the NFU, and we represent growth of food, fibre and energy. So wheat production in the UK, 16 to 18 million tonnes on average. The biofuel market, ethanol market, is a vital market for our industry. It underpins investment in cereal production. It underpins short-term investment, medium-term investment and long-term investment. About 2 million tonnes a year go from UK wheat production into the biofuel plants. and of that 2 million tonnes, around 800,000, just under half, is returned back to UK livestock growers in the form of distillers' grains as a vital feedstock, a high protein feedstock which goes to displace imported soya in many cases. So it is a market, and it's a functioning market. Also, in our wheat growth, we have issues with quality. Many growers will grow for milling wheat, which in a bad year with poor weather does not meet specification. That wheat has to go somewhere, and the UK biofuel market soaks up a lot of that out of spec milling wheat. And again, so that supports, actually, so doesn't compromise our cereal production. It actually helps support it because there's another market outside of milling wheat. So, like I said, it's quite a small area as well. Between 2 and 4% every year of the UK wheat area goes into the biofuel market. And so, getting rid of the mandate could well have an adverse impact on our wheat markets and our wheat production. And I not only want to speak about just bioethanol, but other biogas products. We grow for AD, anaerobic digesters, which are fantastic for our markets, also fantastic for our widening of our crop rotations, which means a lot. It helps reduce pesticide usage, it helps reduce fertilizer usage because you're growing different crops in rotation. So, it's not just about bioethanol. And also we can talk about fibre markets in terms of land use and what they could mean to energy production. Hemp, flax, etc. Those are all infant markets which are just starting up, but they need encouragement, but they are vital in terms of what we do. So again, bioethanol helps underpin our markets. It doesn't detract from our growing, it actually underpins it. It's notable that we actually import around 750,000 tonnes of German and Canadian wheat every year. That's a high protein, high spec wheat that we can't grow in this country. So, we do import wheat, we export a lot of wheat. Again, bioethanols helps us soak up our surplus and reduces our reliance on export feed markets around the world.
Thanks very much. Just to let people know, hopefully you're all aware, but we will move on to questions from the audience, so get your thinking caps on, but I'm going to abuse my position as chair and get things started. Dillon, it was something you mentioned in your introduction. I think it's important that when we talk about bioethanols or any green policy, we look at the entire life cycle. We don't just look at the end outcome. So how should we think about the opportunity cost for things like land use when we're looking at crop-based biofuels?
Yeah. Absolutely. So this is one of the issues that we look at quite heavily in the report. From a land use perspective, essentially we take the position that most of this land, given it's being used by farmers in an agricultural perspective right now, should go to food production, given the food security situation we have right now. And it's not just land here in the UK, it's land all over the place. We import a lot of corn from the United States. We also import quite a bit of corn from Ukraine. In 2022, Ukraine was one of the top 5 suppliers into the RTFO, and it's sort of remarkable to me that given all the sort of food security implications of growing biofuels and sort of particularly also the last crisis, that this that we still continue to use quite a bit of land in this way. But as I alluded to in the introduction, also when you think about land from sort of an opportunity cost perspective, we think this land should be going to food production, but even if you were going to say we should use this land for environmental reasons because we need, we have to have these emission savings, and this is the only way we're going to decarbonize petrol. Essentially, a lot of the research we cover in the report shows the emission savings would likely be way higher if you, for example, put solar panels on that land or you left that land to rewild. So I think from a sort of opportunity cost for land use perspective, it's at least from my own perspective, difficult to justify biofuels making sense from a sort of societal perspective any way you cut it, as much as I appreciate that for the individual farmers who are planting those crops, it's a beneficial policy in that it raises prices and supports sort of investment in the sector.
Matt, did you want to come back on that? I mean, farmers have a really important role in helping the country achieve net zero, but obviously that's an important thing to consider.
Absolutely. Food security is a really interesting one to start off with. Some of the issues on food security we've seen in the last 12 to 18 months, nothing to do with cereal production, not in the UK. We've seen shortages of eggs, potentially, peppers, cucumbers, tomatoes, not cereal production. So when we talk about food security, let's really define what we're talking about. We grow good cereals, we grow a lot of cereals, and we do have surpluses. So it's not always about raising prices. It's about having a market for those places to go to. But in terms of net zero, farmers can do a lot on the net zero journey. Absolutely agree. Investing in biodiversity, but that's all done not at the expense of growing crops. It's done with growing crops. We are looking for new fertilizer technologies, greener fertilizers, different types of crops that use less fertilizer. So I spoke about some of the fiber crops that actually, to achieve a good margin, use less fertilizer than a traditional wheat crop. But those things are all grown in the mix. We're not monocropping, we're diversifying our cropping. But again, I don't think that should be at the detriment of a 2 million tonne wheat market when we always have a surplus.
Dustin, I can see you've got notes on this topic. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, I should probably declare my interest. So I was the chief analyst on the Dimbleby National Food Strategy. So I did a lot of deep thought on food security and its relationship with renewables. And I guess the headline conclusion on the relationship between energy and food is that bioenergy is basically the only renewable that has a real conflict with food security because it's so land intensive. I took the liberty of doing some numbers beforehand to give you some stats, which I hope will stick in the mind. So imagine your average London garden. If you plastered that with solar panels, and I'm not sure I'd recommend this, you could power 3 EVs per year, average driving, average kind of size EV. That gives you just a bit of a sense of how far you can go, what you can do with solar panels on your theoretical garden. If you grew biofuels in that garden instead and had your own little mini refinery and put it into your car, you'd fuel a car for 10 days. That's a good way of getting a sense of just how land inefficient those biofuels are. So 10 days of fuel for your car from biofuels, 3 EVs each for a year with solar panels. And the reason is that electricity is really efficient and EVs are really efficient. When you translate that to the country as a whole, you've got a very large land area that's potentially used to grow biofuels already today, so about 2% of croppable land, which is kind of roughly in the estimates of 2 to 4%, significant, not a disaster, but significant. But you have to think, what could you do with this food if you weren't using it for biofuels? I take your point about milling wheat, you're not going to turn it into bread. But we've got on the order of 600 million people across the world who are going hungry. That's World Food Programme stats, not mine. And if you took all the biofuels, the crop-based biofuels that the UK uses, and fed them to people instead, they're not going to get a nice baguette, I give you that, but they might get a porridge or something that is going to keep them alive. You'd feed 3.5 million people. So from a what is the best use of that land perspective, I'd rather take the biofuels money, subsidize the crops, and give it away for free in humanitarian aid, just from a what's the best use of this. I'd never stick it in a car. I'd rather throw up solar panels and pay people to have EVs.
Matt, did you want to come back on that point?
So the solar panels argument is an interesting one. You're not going to grow crops in your garden in Kensington, are you? But you're going to grow them out in the fields out in the countryside.
I should just say I grew a small rye crop in my front garden several years ago.
It's never going to get to process point, is it?
3 pancakes worth of rye.
But what I'm saying is, if you want to concentrate on solar, let's cover the roofs. Let's use the space. Every new build, let's put solar panels on it. Every car park, every train station has got a car park. Where are the solar panels? Currently, they're going out in the field. So you talk about food security 1 minute, and then you want to cover the fields with solar panels. And where does this food argument end? I can see 3 or 4 bottles of beer here being drunk. Where does that come from? Malting barley, grown in the UK. It's not a food source. In fact, as I said to one brewer once, it's actually a poison we're growing. So, where does it stop? The markets drive it. We know that. We know what people want to do with their money. They want to buy beer. They want to eat bread. They want to spend their money how they want to spend it. And they want to put fuel in their cars at the moment. When the technologies are there, things will be more efficient. I get what you say about feeding the world, but before biofuels, we weren't feeding the world. Wheat wasn't getting to the right places. And that's not the fault of the UK grower and the UK biofuel mandate. That's the fault of world politics.
So we started this discussion of petrol and diesel. We've gone slightly broader, which is obviously fantastic. But Howard, you said at the beginning in your introduction, drivers want clean air too. How can we transition to net zero at a lower cost to motorists if this isn't the answer?
Well, there's a premise you just said in your question, net zero, right? That you're making the assumption that net zero is the incredible nirvana that we've got to go to. I just feel as though we shouldn't have these targets, the 2030 target or the 2050 target. We should be all in it together to get clean fuel technology. And the evolution to that is everyone would support. But it's terrible when, I get something like 2,000 emails a week and people saying, should I buy an electric vehicle? What should I do? Should I buy a hybrid? What do I do with my diesel, which has done 200,000 miles and looked after me, no problem at all, 80 miles to the gallon? And okay, I live on the 8th floor of a lot of flats. How do I charge my Nissan Leaf? I'm 6'7". I can't get in a Nissan Leaf. These are the sorts of things I get, and I'm afraid I'm totally anti the politics that's gone into this, rather than the practicality and the science behind it. I was just up. I was on the radio today on Talk TV up against Dale Vince, if anyone's heard of him, ecotricity guy. And he pathologically hates me. But, I've learned since he's making £50 million a year out of green technologies. Good luck to him. I'm all for that. But I actually represent drivers, and for 13 years, I've not taken a penny out of what I do because I believe that drivers are demonised and blamed. I was stuck in a taxi coming over here as well because a certain person was actually about 4 or 5 and were carrying a banner, and it's saying, stop oil, etc. What we need to get rid of all this stupidity and work together on technology. And this is where I do totally agree with you, Dustin. I love technology. We must work together on technology. But equally, we should be using fields to grow food, not for growing petrol.
Well, I'm with you on the biofuels point. I think we should unite in favour of the 2030 petrol and diesel new car ban. My pitch is basically, nobody's going to get their cars taken away. If you want to buy a fossil fuel vehicle and hang on to it, well, kind of good luck to you. Yeah, you can hang on to it if you want to. You're going to pay a lot more. You're going to have a lot more pollution. There's going to be a lot more air pollution, and you're going to find that you're kind of. Hey, if you want to hang on to your old technology, who am I to tell you how to live your life? But for new cars, it's absolutely mad that we should continue to support these incredibly polluting, incredibly sort of bad vehicles. Why not switch straight to EVs? They're already cheaper to own on a total life cycle basis. And as I showed you with my solar stats, they also use way less land to fuel. So I can't kind of see the opposition on the 2030 thing. Just on the climate.
Yeah, can I just take it up on one point there?
Let me make my point on climate. So. I don't think I can agree to disagree on the kind of climate story. If anyone was in the country this summer and felt the 40-degree heat wave.
One day at Heathrow Airport where there's loads of tarmac.
I was also feeling it myself.
It was pretty warm. I loved it.
It was bloody hot. And it was the hottest it's ever been. And if you look over the last decade, a third of the world's population has experienced the hottest temperatures on record. I think we're well past is this happening? And we're now into the, holy Moses, how do we stop this from
but you go 1,000 years back, it was happening then too.
It was not happening 1,000 years back.
We're going through cycles.
We're gonna. I'm not going to persuade you on the climate side here, but I encourage the audience to read the IPCC's latest report.
Your Bible. Yeah, so it's thrown at me every interview I go to. The IPCC.
The respected results of literally thousands of eminent scientists from across the world.
And I know thousands of eminent scientists also in other reports saying the opposite.
I don't think you can persuade Howard on the 2030 target either, but Dillon.
Yeah, I was just going to say, maybe even putting net zero aside for a second, sort of this discussion, even accepting for a second that the 2030 ban is happening, as Dustin said, EVs are significantly cheaper over the life cycle now than a petrol or diesel car. So for pure cost reasons alone, your next car should be an EV. And you're talking about hydrogen and e-fuels, which are both important and valuable. Those are going to cost a hell of a lot more than biofuels are. So from a cost perspective, I don't think that's a cheaper way to net zero.
The current cycle per mile, I think it's 19p per mile, diesel and petrol. No, it's 17p per petrol now, because diesel and petrol are coming down, dare I say it. And if you charge on the road, on outside of your home, you're looking at 19p for charging per mile electric vehicles. So there's no comparison. And I go back to this cradle to grave situation. Are you quite happy to go to sleep at night knowing that there's youngsters in the Belgian Congo using their bare hands to rip out for lithium and cobalt?
Belgian Congo? Oh, come on.
Sorry, what's the problem with that?
It's a bit retrograde, man.
Well, is it not happening? How is it being mined then? Oh, all right, okay. Thank you for the point. Thanks for the geography lesson. I didn't realise you were saying that. But those sorts of things, what people are worried about. Look, let me say, I feel I'm intruding a bit here. What I'm trying to say to you is people out there don't get it. They've got their diesel and petrol vehicle and they see these headlines that they are demons, they're poisoning the planet, they're killing the children, all these things. And Sadiq Khan is a classic example of lying about health fatalities, and I can go into that at length. But the thing is, what we need to do, and I've said it, and if anyone's listening again, we should work together to try and get clean fuel technology. In the last 10 years, the HGV industry have halved their emissions. They've gone from Euro 4 to Euro 6. And if we're allowed to get to Euro 8, it'll be even better. But we're not, because the government's saying, no, you're not going to produce any internal combustion engine. You're going to produce electric vehicles. And they're putting this EV production mandate and 22% next year and 80% by 2030. It's not right, and it's unconsulted, and it's not going to work. It's just going to bankrupt the UK.
Okay. Now seems like a good time to move to audience questions, if that's okay. So stick your hand up in the air. We've got a roving mic, so please wait until that gets to you. I'm going to take them in pairs, if that's okay. And if you could just introduce yourselves. But yeah, first one there.
Hello, can you hear me? Yep. Daniel Heesman, Beringa Consultancy. Thank you to the panel. That was really interesting discussion, really insightful. Could I get the panel's views on including electricity into the RTFO? And what would that look like? How would that work? Thank you.
Okay, and then Benny, did you have a question?
Yeah, Benny Pizer, Net Zero Watch. I'm surprised that as a result of picking a loser like biofuels, the panel, or most of the panel now thinks picking electric vehicles is the solution. Why didn't you invite someone from the car manufacturing industry to talk about, technology? You have heard that the EU has given up on the ban of combustion engine cars because the German car industry claims they have a solution different to electric vehicles. So wouldn't it be better to be technology neutral rather than saying we ban all cars that have a combustion engine, and rather than go for some kind of economic incentives to drive technology? So these kind of top-down bans or subsidies in terms of biofuels seem to have a very, very poor track record. So why repeat the mistakes of the past by, again, picking losers?
Great. Dillon, you're the report's author. Do you want to go first?
Sure. Maybe taking the electricity point first. So for context, many European countries, or some European countries, essentially include electricity in their sort of RTFO equivalents, and essentially if you're a charge point operator, you can generate credits by supplying renewable electricity to EVs. Boom, you boost the charging network, and sort of countries like Germany and the Netherlands have found success with it. We talk about it a fair bit in the report, and potentially as a way to sort of account for the fact that crops have phased down and you still have these targets. If you can't change the targets, then maybe electricity is a good way to meet them. We mentioned it's certainly a promising idea, but also you're introducing a lot of complexity into a policy that is already quite complex, and hence sort of you need to do quite a bit of detailed thinking to make sure that the standards make sense so that the policy sort of does what you want it to do and doesn't just flood the market or, for example, over-subsidize something that's already getting subsidies from a lot of different angles. So I'd say we're sort of interested in the policy, but it's a complicated one. Look, on the technology lock-in point, I hear you, right? The net zero, you are sort of taking bets on technology. In biofuels was one bet that a lot of countries took, and we see where it's turning out now. EVs certainly is the bet that most countries are taking on, at least for cars. There certainly are other technologies that are available. Hydrogen, people sort of have a lot of faith in, and e-fuels. I mean, for cars it's slightly bonkers, but for in other sectors like aviation, e-fuels can make a significant difference. This will require some tough choices. As a free market person, I would love to just put a carbon tax on everything and leave it to the market to work out everything.
You're against the ban, right? As a free market person, you are against the ban of combustion engine.
As a free market person, I hate that I have to use bans to do these things, but we have to decarbonize, and that does mean picking some technological bets. I am a member of the Green Blob, so that's fair.
Dustin, did you want to come in on particularly on the electricity point, perhaps?
Yeah, on the stick electricity and the RTFO, I mean, I think I'm not a million miles apart from Dillon. A lot of complexity, a lot of questions about if you're providing an upfront subsidy to get EVs into the market, do you also want to subsidize the use of the electricity? Questions about measurement and all that kind of thing. I guess I would like it if I was persuaded that we couldn't ditch the RTFO, or certainly to get crop-based biofuels out of the RTFO. So for me, it's maybe like a third best policy. I'll accept it, but I'm not wild about it. It doesn't feel like the best approach. Benny, I want to touch on your point about like picking winners. I guess my observation is that in the business world, you're always picking winners, and like it or not, aside from a kind of theoretical world in which every country doesn't have industrial strategy, we now have some big economic blocs that have taken big industrial strategy decisions in favor of EVs. So the Chinese government has been admirably clear. They've said, we're never going to be competitive in fossil fuel vehicles. We are going to drive battery electric vehicles, and we are going to dominate the market by doing that. That's why the cheapest EV that you can buy in the world is an electric car made in China, because the government has forced that. Now, you might quite reasonably say that's a terrible betrayal of free market principles, and you might be right. But in reality, that's where the money is going, and that's the technology that's being driven. The United States has followed suit. You've got IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. Again, it's driving investment out of the UK and into the United States for battery electrics. If I look at the German car companies, you've got VW and BMW that are clear that they're going all electric. So the moment for a kind of, should we reintroduce some sort of spurious, frankly, technology neutrality into a debate where clearly the market has chosen, it just feels misplaced. Now is the point to get on with the EVs, be competitive in making them, try to innovate in being better at it. That's where you're going to create value, and I think there's no reason why the UK shouldn't support that for British companies.
Howard, you seem to agree on the tech neutral point. I suppose the idea being that, if you encourage drivers to go down one particular route and it transpires a few years later, that wasn't the best decision. It's drivers who sort of end up carrying the burden.
Well, I mean, really, Benny should be sitting here. I know Benny for a long time, and he talks a hell of a lot of sense. The thing that gets me is the only reason why electric vehicles are going to be incredibly successful is if you put a ban on the competition. And I don't see that as fair. That's in a free market environment. Why do we have to be 2030? Why can't we put a moratorium and make it something like to 2040 and allow, as I say, clean fuel technology to evolve the best way possible and encourage and incentivize as best as possible? What we're seeing at the moment in time is, and I've got to repeat this, I represent grassroots people who drive. Mr. and Mrs. Joe Bloggs, 75-year-old got their Peugeot 205 or whatever they got. They rely on it, they go to Tesco's in it, and they're being told, you've got to ride a bicycle or buy an electric vehicle. These are the sorts of things we're getting from the government rather than common sense. What we need to do is invest in internal combustion engine. We've got to have fossil fuels. I don't think, you made that premise again like you did earlier about net zero. We've got to decarbonise. Why? I still don't. No one's given me a reason for that. CO2 is one of the best. It's a food crop. for food for crops. I just don't understand the way we're being told things which basically, they're not all lies, but I'm sorry, I'm being told a lie by a lot of the people that I hear from in that have got a lot of influence that I didn't elect.
Okay, anyone else got any questions? I'm going to make Elizabeth run around the room. This gentleman, and then that one.
Thank you very much, Anthony Hopkins, also from the NFU, and I feel a bit like an evil farmer today. I'm usually, if this isn't being recorded as an impartial organisation, a huge fan of the CPS, but this does feel a little bit like the arguments are being picked to fit the end in this. And I'd like to ask a few quick questions. So, do you think this target for 2033 EVs is realistic, and what about the impact of getting there? And where are we going to build all these solar farms? Where are we going to get our energy from? Don't we need this kind of technology in the short term to get there? Secondly, if anyone would like to put their hand up if they think that 3.5 million tonnes of food that's magically going to appear will get to those starving people in any part of the world, please do put your hand up right now. Because what will happen if you lose this output for the rubbish stuff is people will grow less of the good stuff. There will be less food grown, and that is what will happen. I know the alternative to that is grain dumping, like we used to have, where we send the surplus we have some years to countries and cause starvation the next when we've destroyed their markets. And finally, Dustin, if I can just ask you, do you think we should also stop the other Neolithic technology of the wheel and get around that one along with the bioethanol, please? Just to be flippant, sorry.
Just while Elizabeth runs around the room, I'm going to speak on Dustin's behalf. I think the wheel is okay. Can we stick with the wheel? Is that fine?
Just to be clear, I'm in favour of ethanol, just not in cars. We can have a beer after the...
One point and one question. The point is, the mandate is actually a zero-emission vehicle mandate. It doesn't mandate electric vehicles. You can get hydrogen vehicles. You can get any form of vehicle that is zero-emission into it. So the question, though, moving away a bit from petrol, is moving on to diesel slightly. Biodiesel, lots of it comes from used cooking oil, lots of it from China and Malaysia. We're pretty certain that some of that is not used cooking oil. It's virgin oil going into the mix. Should we not just ban foreign imports of used cooking oil?
Dillon, do you want to start with the sort of diesel fraud point?
Yeah, look, it's a fair question. It's something we examined quite a bit in the report. You do have this weird scenario where something that is meant to be a waste suddenly gains a big economic value, which then, by market forces, means there is sort of the incentive to fraud. There are sort of standards and programs set into the RTFO to prevent something like that from happening. There have been cases in the past. There's a big Dutch producer called Kampen that sort of got into a big scandal for marketing fraudulently a lot of biodiesel that wasn't what they said it was. I hear you. Something like 50% of the used cooking oil in our biodiesel is from China. It's a very small percentage that actually comes from the UK. I think, frankly, the problem with banning imports of all of it is just we don't have nearly enough of it here in the UK to meet these blending targets. So it's certainly a difficult issue. We recommend other ways in the report so that the government can be a little bit more sure about the origin of the used cooking oil. But I think banning all imports sounds great in theory and yet maybe a little bit difficult in practice.
I suppose the fraud point then, Matt, tips us back in favour of crops. Is there anything you wanted to add on that point or any of the other points?
Well, you certainly won't hear me arguing against banning substandard dubious crops coming into this country, because it's not just oils that come to this country that are grown to a substandard to what is grown and produced in this country in many things. So I think we should always be very, very stringent on what we use, what we're told it is. I just want to talk the flexibility in cropping and ethanol. It's not strictly true that 2 million tonnes is grown for biofuels. It's not like it's a particular variety of wheat that everyone rushes to grow. So, there's flexibility within that. So it's just the market that soaks that up. So I think it's quite important to mention that. And when we talk about electrics, I go back to what I said about solar. If you want a flexible food market, Don't cover your land in solar panels, which locks them up for 25 years. You know, that's the agreement. Once you've put those solar panels on a field, it's 25 years. You can't use that again. Even if you wanted to, you're in. So, you know, there is flexibility in biofuels. That's one thing that we have, and the market dictates that. And I think when you're looking at hybrid vehicles, that's a switch over to people are switching from petrol, diesel to hybrids. The petrol has an inclusion in it, so it's a greener fuel than the diesel. It's a step. The hybrid is a step. I know it's not a big enough step for some, but it is a step. So, and those steps are being made. Technologies are helping those steps, and I think that's what we need to encompass really and look at and embrace rather than push things away. We've done it before where everything's been pushed away and it's had adverse effects. You know, the biodiesel market's quite an interesting one. A lot of rapeseed oil was used for biodiesel. It was a byproduct. You know, when I used to go out to Poland to meet Polish farmers, they grew rapeseed, not for the oil, they grew it for the husk and the protein feed. The oil became the byproduct which had a use and went into biodiesel. We can't grow rape in this country, half the rape crop that we used to due to pests. So our oil is imported. If we could grow the 2 million tonnes of rape we used to grow, then we wouldn't have to import the oil for biodiesel. We'd have a surplus of oil, but we can't, so it comes in via dubious sources, as you mentioned.
Let me just come on to the solar point. I'm gonna try out a free market argument here, and that is, why should the dead hand of the state stop farmers from putting solar panels on their land if they want to and if they're going to make revenue? Exactly, but why should it? If you as a farmer think, crikey, there's a bit of my land that doesn't grow crops very well, quite like to stick some solar panels on it, I'll have the revenue, I'll use that clean electricity to help decarbonize my farm business, maybe I'll have an electric tractor, why should anyone stop you?
Well, it isn't. You aren't stopped from doing it. In fact, you're subsidised to do it.
So
the market is subsidised. The electricity solar market is subsidised, isn't it? You've got the feed-in tariff.
Solar is no longer subsidised. We killed the feed-in tariff back in, I think, 2018. Now it's just the value of the electricity. But I mean, the point is, why as a farmer should you not be free to make your own choices about how to use your land? And because solar is a really good use of not the best cropland, use it on the farm. I'm going to say bloody brilliant. And if I run the analysis about how much land that could take by 2050, if we want to end up in a zero carbon system, then it's 0.3% of UK land. It's a tiny fraction. I take your point about putting it on roofs. Absolutely, we should plaster every roof we can with solar panels. But I see no reason why we shouldn't also judiciously allow farmers, particularly on less good quality land, to put solar on. And the other thing I want to just raise is there's also this really cool technology called agrivoltaics, which is really simple. It's basically stick solar panels on stilts and grow your crops underneath them. And the reason why this works, as I understand, although there are two farmers in the room, so please do correct me if I'm wrong, is that for the most of the year, it's not lack of sun that prevents you from maximizing your crop yields, unless you're that one farmer from Northumberland who's got his 18 tons per hectare. He's probably not going to grow solar panels. But in most systems, the yield penalty is really low. So there's a great German study that said agrivoltaics, i.e. solar panels with crops grown underneath, cuts the yield of the crop by only about 7%. And if you think about it from a value perspective, you're making money from the solar and from the crops. So the only objection that I can see is maybe you don't like the look of them, which is fair, but it's a different sort of argument. Do you want to? Sorry, I'm stealing your chair.
But I would just say the yield penalty might not be that high. But if you want really high quality milling wheat or something like that, it will not grow with that absence of light because it's the stuff that's really high end that needs the best conditions. So if you want to grow lots of animal feed or stuff making bioethanol, that'd be great. It won't make your bread.
Okay, so it depends on the crops being grown, for anyone who didn't hear. We've got time for a couple more questions, if anyone has one. That one.
Hiya, I'm Andy McDonald from OpenAI, which is irrelevant to this. But Howard, I disagree with you on a lot of things, but I think you got it pretty bang on the 2030 point. And this is more for Dustin than anyone. You know, do you genuinely think the physical infrastructure and the cultural infrastructure is there for a complete move to electric vehicles? Because for most parts, you know, it's all good thinking about metropolitan areas, but if you think about towns, you know, ex-mining areas like that, you can pick up a little petrol dinger for 1,300 quid. You know, it's pretty easy to do so, and that'd last, you know, 3, 4, 5, 6 years if you're lucky. how is the kind of transition going to go culturally to electrical vehicles, by 2030, if not by 2040?
Hi, I'm Nick Matthews from the Department of Transport. First of all, thank you for a very interesting panel and good discussion. My question would be whether we've talked an awful lot about cars, but you're really interested in the panel's view on decarbonisation of other modes, so in particular heavy goods vehicles, heavy duty vehicles, aviation and maritime. Thank you.
Dustin, do you want to take both first?
I'll give it a go. So you're absolutely right to point out that if you are the sort of person who buys a third-hand vehicle, it's going to make economic sense for you right now to buy an old banger. It'll be a petrol or a diesel car, right? The value of doing a bit of technology forcing with a 2030 new car ban, so nobody's taking away existing cars, it's just what can be sold new, is that it drives the second and third hand market. So if you look at who buys cars, you really want the value of that cheap EV to be in the hands of the person who can only afford the third hand car, because the running costs on EVs are so much lower than the running costs of petrol cars. And also the cost to repair for that old car, as anyone who has not had a lot of money will know, when your car breaks, it's like, oh Christ, I don't know whether I can afford to fix it. The good thing about EVs is they break less frequently, and when they break, they tend to be, well, if they're repairable, less expensive. So I think there is a value in getting this into the hands of people who will never afford the new car, whilst also driving the cost of new cars down. The one rider I'd say is we do need charging infrastructure. We need that charging infrastructure to be available throughout lots of the country. So that's the main benefit, I think, to go back to the electricity and the RTFO. If you can use that to support charging infrastructure, particularly on the strategic motorway network or some of the other stuff, that's really important. On the metropolitan versus rural point, I guess if I was thinking about who's going to have difficulty getting the cheapest charging at home overnight, it's urban people, not rural people, because rural people tend to have the space to put an EV charger, so they ought, in principle, to get the cheapest possible system. Just on the HGVs and aviation, much more of a technology crystal ball story, I'd say. On HGVs, I'm cautiously optimistic that maybe the battery EV guys will do better than we expect. I don't know. I think we to a certain extent have to see, but I would support some technology forcing in that direction to work out whether or not it works. Aviation is a whole nother kettle of fish, and I think I've got rather radical views here. In really crude terms, I think in essence, there are two companies that make airplanes, Airbus and Boeing. It's a duopoly. The Chinese are really trying to catch up, and there are a few small players like Embraer out there trying to give it a go. But if you want zero carbon aviation, you need new airframes. And building a whole new airframe is a bet the company kind of challenge. So my own view is that you really need to induce either Boeing or Airbus, and we're in Europe, so it's Airbus, in order to make that big investment in a radically new airframe, because clean fuels, although absolutely essential, we definitely need sustainable aviation fuels, and they almost certainly need to be e-fuels in order to make it happen. We also need radically new airframes so that the planes themselves need probably half the fuel that they need today. And the good news is that Uncle Sam has invested in the initial research to make this possible. So NASA did some excellent work a couple of years ago on new airframes that have the fuel burn for medium and long-haul aviation. I would love it if Britain, with its absolute engineering excellence, particularly in wings, got on board and built the zero-carbon airliner of the future.
I suppose it's not just airliners versus cars, Matt. There are lots of different vehicles, quite heavy ones on farms. How do you decarbonise those?
There are, and much like the heavy goods vehicles, we are running diesel tractors. We've got AdBlue at the moment, so we use AdBlue technology, which helps with particulates. But there is technology coming down the line. It's hydrogen. I'm not sure electric tractors are ever going to make it. I think that technology is going to be superseded. I just don't think they'll have the running times for the size of the batteries to power 300 horsepower tractors. It's going to be very, very short running times. HVO is a technology that people are talking about, which is waste oil. Tractors totally run on waste oil. That's another one that's being looked at. But those technologies are coming, but they're not there yet. But of course, we'll embrace those technologies as growers. We see the value in net zero in our supply chains, and what demands of net and decarbonising, call it what you like, sustainability. We see the value coming down in those supply chains, and we'll have to use technologies to meet those demands, and maybe create markets. But they're not on farm yet, that's for sure. Just like they're not really on the roads yet in terms of HGVs.
Okay, we've got just over a minute left, so I'm going to return to the subtitle of today's event, The Future of the Biofuels Mandate, and give every panellist just 30 seconds. In your opinion, what should the future of the biofuels mandate be? Are we scrapping, reforming, keeping, something else? And we'll just go left to right.
I suppose you guys have all seen the lovely report. We think we should drop the crops. And also, but at the same time, we still think there's value in the RTFO, particularly on the waste side, and particularly for sectors like HGVs, for whom zero emissions options are a little bit further off. So drop the crops and strengthen the rest of the program.
Well, I think you know where I stand on this. I'm sure I'm a bit of a pariah in this room. What I do believe is that we've got to think about the cost. E10 was introduced, and it's fundamentally it costs more to fill up your car, and the older vehicles were forced into expensive 95 premium. They got rid of the old one. You had to have the 97. So what I would like to see, and I'm going to repeat it, and it sounds like a stuck in a groove, can we work together on clean fuel technology without the bans, the edicts, and telling us what we must and can't do? And electric vehicles aren't what they're like. We're about to produce a cradle to grave report with a number of very, very big groups. And unfortunately, that EV little fantasy you've got. I'm sorry. Well, yeah, unless leave diesel and petrol, you cannot survive without banning diesel and petrol.
I think we could do a whole other event on electric vehicles, but that's for another day. Dustin.
Thanks. I'll be brief. I guess, look, pretty clear. I don't think we should have crop-based biofuels. I think they're a terrible misuse of land. They're not good for the climate. Within directed land use change, they're often worse. I'd ditch them about as quickly as we could, and you free up loads of land and therefore food, which in principle could feed people, which is the overriding need today.
I'd like to disagree with that. As long as we have petrol and diesel, and there's a market for bioethanol, and it is a market, then we should have the ability to fulfil that market as growers. And it underpins food production, and it doesn't take away from food production in the UK, that's for sure. And we're a very, very small part of the world in terms of crop production. So let's service our markets as required.
Right, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to Dillon, Howard, Dustin and Matt for joining me, and thanks to the European Climate Foundation for sponsoring the Drop the Crops report. It's available on cps.org.uk, and thank you all for coming.